Can everyone hear me? Yeah, hello? Okay. So my name is Ellen Holstein. I'm program coordinator here at Cedar Creek Institute, and I want to welcome you to our first Lunch and Learn of the new year. Thank you guys for coming. I want to just highlight a few programs we have coming up before I introduce our speakers so you know what other exciting things we have coming up at the Institute. Tomorrow night we actually have candlelight trails, so we'll be putting candles out on our trails from 7 to 9:30. I know we don't have enough snow for snowshoeing. Unfortunately, I can't order that snow to come in. But we will have some beautiful candles out. It should be a nice, clear night if the weather is not lying to me. And so come out for that. In February, there's a couple of interesting programs I thought you guys might be interested. One is the Faces of Conservation. The Barry County Conservation District are basically getting together a lot of like-minded conservation-oriented people. They're giving basically an hors d'oeuvre and snack type thing at the Waldorf and getting a lot of local organizations together. So if you have any questions on that, we have a flyer that's out in our entryway, and I can try to answer as many questions about that as I can. The other thing that you guys might be interested in February, on February 23rd, so it's a Friday in the evening, we are going to be screening the documentary From the Ashes. It's a National Geographic documentary, and it's basically about the war on coal, so from multiple perspectives. And then we'll have a panel discussion afterwards, and we'll have basically someone from the private sector, someone from Consumers Energy, and right now I'm still trying to see who, but somebody from the Michigan Agency for Energy coming and answering questions and having hopefully a very good discussion about the state of coal in Michigan. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is John Richter. He is on the board of directors of the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association and is a member of the Speakers Bureau. He has a master's degree in renewable energy from Murdoch University in Perth, Australia, and taught solar energy classes at Macomb County Community College. He's been speaking on energy topics for 25 years at a variety of venues, including the U.S. congressional staff in D.C., and he has spoken many times here at the Institute in the past at our sustainability conferences. So he's kind of a veteran here at the Institute. He's here today to speak about the Michigan's energy economy. And just to let you guys know, we are going to videotape this, so that will be up, as well as making slides available for people that want them. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming John.
Thank you. Good morning. Is the mic working okay?
Yes.
Hear me good? Small group. I want to make this informal. I'm going to cover a lot of information. I'm going to move through slides kind of quick. They are going to post them. If you want a copy, I can email it to you, so you don't have to like try and catch things and take notes and get down facts and figures. Feel free to stop me if you have questions. Just raise your hand. We'll try and make this as interactive as we can. It's a nice small group, so I think we can do that quite nicely. All right. So I'm going to talk about energy trends in a very broad sense. I'm going to talk about those at a global level, at a national level, and a state level. I'm going to talk about problems with fossil fuels, and I'm guessing that this audience is probably really familiar with those, so I'm going to go through that really fast. I'm going to talk about sales trends, electric vehicles, solar, and wind, and what's happening in those industries. And then I'm going to focus on Michigan and what's happening with renewable energy here in Michigan. I'm going to talk about the utilities' reaction to the success of renewables, which has been striking, and policy changes. It's actually, I can only think of one other time in the last 25 years when there's been as much happening in energy policy as there is right now. So from that perspective, we live in exciting times. You'll learn about Michigan's energy economy, and we really fit into national trends. As I looked at the statistics on Michigan, Michigan isn't like remarkably different than the rest of the country. We have a couple areas where we're a little different, but we're really following the trends, maybe trailing a little bit. Burning fossil fuels creates numerous problems, and if we're going to avert climate change, we're going to have to make drastic cuts in our CO2 emissions. Wind and solar are still small. They used to be negligible. They were so small they just didn't matter on any kind of chart. That's no longer true, and they're growing very quickly still. Rooftop photovoltaic installations are now perceived as a serious threat to the utility companies, and they are striking back. And Michigan energy policies are undergoing some dramatic changes right now. I'm going to talk about those. So we talk about fossil fuels, and I just like to set the historical tone here. Fossil fuels are relatively new. Until the Industrial Revolution, all of our energy was renewable. So remember we used to talk about alternative energy? It was the alternative to fossil fuels and nuclear, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, there wasn't alternative energy. This was the energy, right? If you wanted to get warm, you lit a fire, and that was usually wood. It might be peat, it might be dung, but you burned something, and it was a biofuel. And if you wanted to get some work done, you hooked up some horses, right? Muscle power was the dominant way that things got done. You might move things with sails, and if you wanted to do some real industrial sort of activity like grinding grain, you used the power of the wind or the power of water. It was all renewable. These weren't alternatives to anything. They were the way things were. If you look at energy consumption in the world with the start of the Industrial Revolution, you can see originally here we've got biofuels, right? It was all biofuels. And then we started adding coal, and then we started adding oil and natural gas and hydroelectric power and nuclear. And you get this exponential growth curve of our consumption of energy, so that in the period from 1820 to 2000, we increased our consumption of energy 25-fold. And so we have in our society now at our disposal energy slaves, machines that do all kinds of wonderful work for us because we have these vast amounts of energy available. That curve's just a little misleading because population was growing exponentially during that period as well. In this curve, we're looking at world energy consumption per person, right? And you see there's still that sort of exponential curve there, and you can see the different fuels coming online. But it's about a factor of 4 increase in per person energy consumption since the Industrial Revolution. I look at that, that sounds a little low to me, because we live in the wealthy West, right? So if you look at the energy consumption of a subsistence farmer in India or Bangladesh, well, their energy consumption really hasn't changed, right? So ours has been able to go up a whole lot more than 4 times. Moving from the global numbers to the national numbers here, this is the history of energy consumption in the United States from the Industrial Revolution. Again, you can see that you've got your biofuels there that kind of reached a peak and then declined, and coal came online. And early 1900s, coal was king, right? The dominant industries of the nation were coal and steel and railroads. And that was all about coal. Coal made the steel, coal fueled the railroads. And so it was coal that took us from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. Oil came online, and of course Henry Ford, right here in Michigan, made the assembly lines that make automobiles affordable, and our consumption of oil skyrocketed, and is still the dominant source of energy. Later on, we developed a lot of hydroelectric dams. Nuclear power came on late to the show here. And down here you see wind energy, right? So it shows on the graph, but it's a nice steep curve. It's growing quickly. It's a little bit dangerous to always look at aggregates, right? An average can hide a lot of information. So, not everyone in the world is consuming the same amount of energy, and in fact, there are dramatic differences. So this is per capita energy consumption in the United States. You see it hasn't varied all that much in this time frame. Energy use in the former Soviet Union, fell as the Soviet Union fell apart. European consumption. But my point here is that in the United States, we're consuming about twice as much energy as the average European, and about 4 times as much energy as the average citizen of the world, or of China, which is right about at the world average now. This is a view here in the U.S. of where we get our energy, and you see that petroleum is still king, and its second cousin, natural gas. Natural gas is often discovered with petroleum. Coal is smaller, but still important. The nuclear power is still a chunk there. Renewable energy, 10%, sounds pretty good. But a lot of that is still hydro, which isn't really expanding much in this country. We've developed the good hydroelectric situations. Wood, we're still burning a good deal of wood. Biofuels here has grown, and that really represents ethanol and biodiesel. And we've got a sizable ethanol industry here in Michigan. Wind is now, kind of on the map, and solar is still very small. Okay, this is a very busy chart, but I love it. So this is U.S. energy use, and then I'm going to show you the same chart for Michigan. Okay? On the left side here, we've got sources of energy. These are called primary energy sources. Petroleum, biomass, coal, natural gas, geothermal, wind, hydro, nuclear, solar. On the right side, we've got sectors of the economy that consume this energy. Transportation, industrial, commercial, it's typically office buildings, shops and things, and residential, our homes. And in between there, we've got electricity generation. So electricity generation is just an energy conversion, right? It consumes primary energy sources and produces electricity that's then used in these other sectors. All of the solar, practically all of the solar energy, all of the nuclear energy, nearly all the hydro, nearly all the wind, all go into electricity production. A chunk of natural gas, a vast majority of the coal, and a little smidgen of petroleum and biomass go into electricity production. Electricity production consumes about 40% of our primary energy, and we can do so many wonderful things with electricity. That conversion process is not terribly efficient. About a third of the energy becomes useful electricity, and about 2/3 becomes rejected heat. Power plants throw off enormous amounts of waste heat and require cooling. This is obviously a big problem with nuclear power plants, right? If they shut down, you have to keep cooling them or they melt, as we discovered in Fukushima. Natural gas, our most flexible fuel. A chunk of it goes into electricity generation, some goes in and heats homes, some heats buildings, some feeds industrial processes. If you're melting metals or making glass or just heating the factory, right? All kinds of uses for natural gas in the industrial zone. Little sliver of natural gas goes into transportation, right? We have natural gas fueled vehicles. Pipelines, which are considered transportation, may actually be powered with natural gas flowing through them. And then biomass, largely into industrial processes, and petroleum predominantly into transportation, and a chunk into industrial processes, particularly the making of plastics and lubricants. Yes?
So this is only the natural gas that goes into energy, not the natural gas that's used as a chemical feedstock?
I believe, if we look at natural gas here, we see, well actually, yeah, it would be industrial. So no, the feedstock aspect of it would be included in that industrial piece, I believe. And yeah, it's particularly used in the production of fertilizers and also synthetic fabrics and into plastics as well. Natural gas is also used to create hydrogen, and hydrogen is used in the petroleum refining industry to thermally crack very heavy oil into lighter oils like gasoline. And it's also used in food production. So if you see on a food label hydrogenated vegetable oils, that means they added hydrogen in a chemical process, and almost all of our hydrogen is produced from natural gas. This is the same diagram only for Michigan instead of the country. You see the same sort of thing, solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, feeding into electricity generation, some natural gas. The big differences between the country and Michigan, the nuclear line looks a little bigger here. We're more reliant on nuclear in Michigan than the country as a whole. A little less natural gas flowing into electricity generation, more coal. So our electricity industry is much more nuclear and coal-based than the country at large. And we feed more natural gas into these sectors because we have a cold climate and we need a lot more heat. So not really an aspect of some decision we made, it's just where we live, it's cold. At a really high level, I like the simplicity of this. What we really do with energy is we heat things, we move things, we produce electricity. And it's 30, 30, 40 is a rough, gauge there, right? And you can just kind of classify anything there. Within the heating things, kind of two big differences. You've just got space heating, right? Providing low temperature, a nice ambient environment for it. Or you've got industrial processes using very high temperature heats, whether you're smelting steel or manufacturing glass. Focusing on the electricity production aspect of it, because that's where renewables really are playing a role, at least so far. This is electricity generation in the United States. Number one is natural gas. Coal has now been displaced into number 2 position in the country, and nuclear is number 3. You've got a chunk of hydro there, wind, 5.5%, not too shabby, biomass and other. In Michigan, the pie chart almost looks the same, but the quantities are swapped around. So at the top, we've got coal at number 2 is nuclear, and natural gas is number 3, wind at 4.2%. So a little less than the national average, but still a significant player. So fossil energy in Michigan. So Michigan is a large state from a population perspective, right? You always see this in the elections. We've got, a good number of electoral college members. We're the 10th largest population in the state. We've got 3% of the country's population, 2.6% of its gross domestic product. And so I put that in there because when you look at how much of different things we're doing, you would expect it to be sort of in line with our population, right? Coal production is 0. We have no operating coal mines in Michigan anymore. We did back in the 1950s. They closed out. But we're a large consumer, 9th in the country on coal, a little disproportionately high compared to our population. We have very little oil, and we produce very little oil. We consume a good bit of oil. We have some natural gas reserves here. We have some production. We're now 18th in the country, and our natural gas production is in decline. We consume a lot of gas. We're in the top 10 there, again, because of our cold climate. We produce electricity kind of in line with our population. Our CO2 emissions are right in line with our electricity production. But we are number 1 in the country in the storage of natural gas. The storage, not the production, but the storage. And that's a geological clue. We have underground caverns that are tightly sealed. They'll hold gas. And so all through the summer, we bring in gas from around the country, particularly the Gulf of Mexico. And it's pumped into these underground storage units, big cluster from here up by Fort Huron, but also around the state, to store that gas, and then it's drawn out of storage during the winter when there's high demand. So in that perspective, Michigan is fairly unique among the states. And there's a nice benefit to that for all of us, which is here in Michigan, we pay about 30% less for our natural gas than the average in the country, even though it's not much of it is produced here, right? We're bringing it in from around the country, but our prices are still lower because we have so much storage facilities here. And in fact, during the winter, Michigan is exporting natural gas out of that storage into the surrounding states. Fossil fuel has many problems, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar with them, but I'm going to run over these. I'm going to start with the cost of oil. Oil is a lot more expensive than just what we're paying for it at the pump. The United States is still importing 25% of our oil. We've all heard about fracking. U.S. oil production has gone up from 40-45% since fracking was unleashed here. But we're still importing 25% of our oil, and that means we have to be very concerned about events in other parts of the world, particularly the Persian Gulf. And we have intervened there in every conceivable fashion ever since the Jimmy Carter administration and the Carter Doctrine that said an invasion of the Middle East will be viewed as an attack on the United States. Fracking has unleashed enormous amounts of oil and natural gas production in the U.S. There's been a lot of discussion about its potential for poisoning water supplies, but it's also responsible for earthquakes. It's a little weird to get your head around, but in the production, in the process of fracking, they produce a lot of contaminated water, which they inject under high pressure in deep wells to dispose of it. And if you think of the plates of the earth, right, that are trying to slide across each other, and they don't because of friction. If you drill a well in that and pump water in under high pressure and make a little space between, you just lubricated the joint, and it slides. And so we're seeing a dramatic increase here in the number of earthquakes in parts of the country that were not previously earthquake prone. So far, very few of them have been very damaging, but it's something that's being monitored closely. A number of states have changed rules about the injection of fracking wastes to try and curb this problem before it gets too serious. Acid rain, this got talked about a lot 20, 30 years ago. The amount of acidic emissions that we're producing has dropped a lot, but it's still a problem. This is the Smoky Mountain National Park. It was a place I visited regularly when I was a kid, and back then it was all green, and it's not anymore. And the acids that we form in our smokestacks and put into the air come down. The rain and the snow are dramatically more acidic than they used to be, and that causes metals, particularly aluminum, to leach out of the soil, and the plants take it up, and it's toxic to them. And usually that itself doesn't kill the tree, but it puts it in a state of serious stress and weakens it. And then disease and insects, in this case bark beetles, come in and kill the trees. One of the things that goes up our smokestacks is mercury. And the amount of mercury is fairly small, but mercury is incredibly toxic. And it's estimated that 600,000 babies in this country are born to a mother whose bloodstream has a level of mercury that's shown to interfere with proper neurological development. I think this is a crime.
How many total births are there?
4 million, yeah. So that's 600,000 out of 4 million. The way this happens is the mercury goes up in the smokestacks primarily from coal-fired power plants, but also in particular from incineration, municipal waste incineration and medical waste incineration. It comes down in the rain, and in the water, it's very, very dilute. And so it seemed at first when people were studying this, it was absurd that this could cause a real problem. But what happens is when plants take up the water, their tissues concentrate the mercury by a factor of roughly 10. Depends on the plant species. And then when the fish eat the plants, it concentrates the mercury by a factor of 10. And the bigger fish eats the little fish and concentrate. And so when you get up at the top of the food chain with the carnivore fish, you can have mercury in their tissues 100,000 times as concentrated as the mercury in the water that they're swimming in. And we eat the fish. We eat the fish, and then it enters the bloodstream, and it's particularly a concern, again, with pregnant women, which is why there's fish advisories for pregnant women, and interferes with the neurological development of their unborn child. Michigan is very much a part of this. This is the concentration of mercury. We're in the overall hot spot, maybe not the very hottest spot, but it's definitely a condition here in Michigan. If you look at what comes out of power plants, right, 77% of the gases that create acid rain are from power plants. 50% of the mercury, as well as toxic metals, arsenic, nickel, chromium. They're all just tiny little components of the coal, and we burn them, and they end up in the air. But perhaps the thing that's killing us most from our air pollution is particulates. Tiny little bits of unburned material, usually carbon, sometimes sulfates, that are emitted from the power plants. And the very smallest ones, the larger ones our lungs know how to deal with, right? We evolved to stop dust and pollen from penetrating into our lungs. Our lungs are lined with cilia. But the very smallest particles less than 2.5 microns, go right through that penetration, enter through our lung tissue into our bloodstream, where they cause heart attacks and strokes. And it's estimated that these particles are causing 200,000 premature deaths in the United States every year. Between 1980 and 2000, our lifespans here in the U.S. increased by 2.7 years, and they're estimating 15% of that came about because of the reduction in particulates as a result of the Clean Air Act. Again, Michigan is not in the worst of this, but we're definitely in the particulate plume. A recent study showed that an increase of 10 micrograms per cubic liter. And if you look at this, you know, we're in the realm of 11 to 12 micrograms versus out here they've got 0, so that's an increase of about 10. Will increase women's risks of fatal heart attacks by 42%. Did you know this? So pollution matters. And notice I haven't even mentioned global warming yet, right? So it's kind of a pet peeve of mine that when people talk about pollution now, they almost make it a synonym with global warming as if that was the only pollutant we need to be concerned with, and I disagree. Our air pollution is causing shorter life, strokes, heart disease, asthma, lung cancer, reduced lung function, and low birth weight. Those are the things we're really rather sure of based on the studies. There are implications tying it to learning disabilities, Alzheimer's, depression, autism, obesity, birth defects, and diabetes, a number of which are pandemic in our society right now. Well, we got to talk about climate change. CO2 is continuing to collect in our atmosphere. This is the concentration of CO2 starting back in 1960. The line is jagged as we go through our seasons. Trees collect CO2 during the summer as their leaves fall and decay. During the winter, it releases some of that back, so you get this seasonal jaggedness, but there's an undeniable long-term trend. Our CO2 levels are up 30%. Methane, which is also a very potent global warming gas, is up 140%. And our concentration of CO2 is the highest in the last 800,000 years. Now, of course, that means that 800,000 years ago it was actually higher, right? So the Earth goes through cycles, and it's just one more cycle. Well, 800,000 years ago, there were no Homo sapiens on the planet. That's how long ago that was. Meanwhile, our measured temperatures are on a clear increasing trend across the years, which is hardly surprising given the CO2 trend. And if you don't believe the thermometers, the Arctic is melting back, and it doesn't show very well, but the area covered by Arctic ice has been decreasing steadily. The ice has also been getting thinner, and the area of the North Pole has shrunk by 10 times the area of the United Kingdom. Most of us aren't really familiar with the North Pole. We don't really look at the map and see how big that is, but it's getting rapidly smaller and thinner. So starting in the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. Navy was measuring the thickness of the North Pole, because as part of the Cold War, we would hide nuclear submarines under the ice, and they'd want to be able to set up a bomb, blow up the ice, break through the ice, and launch their missiles in the event of nuclear war. And so they were measuring the thickness of the North Pole. They mapped it out very carefully, and what we're discovering is that it's getting rapidly thinner. So how are we reacting to this? Well, we're reacting by pumping larger quantities of CO2 into the air every year. Not really what you'd want the reaction to be. And the per capita emissions of CO2 are much higher in the U.S. than China, Europe, the rest of the world, just as our energy consumption is higher. Obviously consequential to that is our CO2 emissions are higher. So how much would we need to cut our CO2 emissions to bring the environment back into balance? The IPCC, which is the UN organization studying global warming, say that we're emitting 6.92 billion tons of carbon a year. That's about 0.9 tons per person, right? 0.9 tons of carbon or 3.3 tons of CO2. It can get confusing reading this because sometimes report carbon weight, some report CO2 weight. The CO2 is heavier because you've added oxygen to it. To keep global CO2 levels below 450 parts per million requires reducing emissions to 3 billion tons per year. So that's the amount that the natural processes, particularly rain and some other things in the atmosphere, can remove CO2. They can remove 3 billion tons of carbon a year, but we're emitting 6.92, so we need to cut our CO2 emissions 57%. That doesn't sound too bad, right? More than half, you cut it down. We'll take a brief pause. So that sounds eminently doable, right? We can cut our emissions 57%. I mean, that's going to take some work, but it's doable. But remember, our CO2 emissions are not evenly distributed. So if you look at different countries, Bangladesh down here doesn't need to cut at all because their CO2 emissions per person are already below what nature can remove. But in Canada, Australia, and the United States here, we're way above that, and we need to cut down to here. So what would that look like? And I had to do the calculation. So our emissions are about 15.5 tons of CO2 per person. The target's 1.5 tons, so we need to cut 90%. Now I'm guessing this is a pretty climate change aware audience. Had any of you heard that number before?
Yeah.
Me? I went out and I looked and I didn't find it anywhere, and I came up with this number and I'm like, can that really be true? And then I found this chart and it's like, well, yeah. I think they don't want to tell us this because if we heard it, we might get hopeless. So this is where our CO2 comes from. Electricity generation is lead at 40%, transportation another 34%. So imagine if all of our electricity production was zero carbon. It was all wind, solar, whatever, and all of our vehicles were electric vehicles charged off of that zero carbon power system. That would reduce us 74%. We wouldn't really get to the 90. But it'd sure be a good start. So let's start there. Let's not lose hope. Let's light a candle rather than curse the darkness. And let's talk about the war on coal. Electricity production from coal in the United States is on a steep decline. If you look just back in 2003, we were getting 51% of our electricity from coal and 17% from natural gas. Now we're getting 30% from coal and 32% from natural gas. The decline in coal use in this country is driven only in very small part by solar and wind. It's driven primarily by cheap natural gas, which came about from fracking. So our electric grid is getting cleaner, and our emissions of all those nasty chemicals and CO2 are all falling as a result of fracking. These are coal power plants in the U.S. These green ones here were proposed and defeated. And amongst existing plants, we've got the sort of reddish pinkish ones here were retired and retirements announced. There are a lot of coal plants closing in the country. They tend to be the older plants and the smaller plants. But they are closing. If you look at this trend in Michigan, back in 2009, we had 66% of our electricity came from coal, and now that's down to 36%. So Michigan is definitely a part of this trend, moving away from coal and to natural gas and a little bit of wind. DTE made a really dramatic announcement here. They said they're going to reduce their CO2 emissions 80% by 2050 2050 is a long time away. A lot can happen between now and then with an announcement. They said a 30% reduction by the early 2020s, 45% by 2030. They're going to add 6 gigawatts of renewable energy, 3.5 gigawatts of natural gas, with a steady retirement of coal plants, 11 by the early 2020s. 3 of them were retired in 2016. And they'll be at 0 coal by 2040. The DTE CEO said that the goal is 40% renewable energy, mostly wind, because, and I quote, wind continues to be substantially cheaper. This is an economic decision made for economic drivers, which is why the price of renewable energy is so terribly important. If you look at investments being made in power plants, let's see, we have fossil and nuclear here. So in 2016, this is the investment in billions of US dollars here in fossil plants and nuclear plants. This is the investment in solar PV, in wind energy, in large-scale hydro, biopower, and other. The point I want to make here is that we are consistently, year after year, investing more in solar and wind than we are in fossil fuels and nuclear combined. I think that's really impressive. It's very slow to change how your entire fleet of power plants is generating electricity, because power plants last a long time. They may be in operation for 40 years, 60 years, 100 years, but we're constantly replacing them, we're constantly building new ones, and so looking at where we're investing in those new ones is really telling you the direction of the future. Global electric production, if you look here, non-renewable electricity is still 3/4 of it. The renewables are about 1/4, but a big chunk of that is hydropower. Wind's about 4%, and solar PV is about 1.5%, so wind and PV 5.5% of global electric production. This was in 2016. They're growing so fast, I think 2017 would be about 6.5%. So it's moving. So when we look at renewable energy systems and we talk about how much renewable energy costs, and this is so central to the discussions right now, right? 30 years ago they said renewable energy just didn't work. And then when it worked over and over again, they said, well, renewable energy just can't scale. And then when we built 100 megawatt wind farms, they said, well, it's just too expensive. And that's where the argument is riding right now, but it's not just the trends are in our favor, the facts are in our favor. There's 2 ways to look at the pricing here. The easy way to get good numbers is the installed cost per watt of generating capacity, right? This is a real one-time cost. When you build the thing, you know what it cost, right? It's very clean. Within policy and regulatory areas, they like to use the levelized cost of energy. So if you have this system, whatever it is, that's going to generate electricity, what did it build to cost? What did it build to feed it fuels if necessary, to maintain it through that lifetime? What was its total lifetime cost? How much electricity did it generate over that lifetime? Divide the two, and you get this levelized cost. But inherent in that calculation are some assumptions about interest rates, the cost of equity, and tax policy, right, which can complicate all that. So if people are projecting the levelized cost of something we just built, it's still subject to, you can have different studies come up with different numbers, right? Whereas if you just say, well, what did it cost to build it? Well, that's pretty clear. Lazard is a consulting firm that computes levelized costs of power production for all these different technologies. They release this on a regular basis. This is their 11th revision of their report. And the bars here, so let's just take solar PV rooftop residential, right? Those are costing something between $187 and $319 per megawatt hour of electricity produced. Okay, most of us don't deal with megawatt hours, right? So what's that mean? Well, it's not too hard. You slide the decimal point over, and this would be 18.7 cents per kilowatt hour. Still pretty pricey, right? What do people pay for electricity? Well, what's on your electric bill in terms of cents per kilowatt hour? Not how many dollars a month, right? Because I don't know how much you use. Hmm?
0.076 per kilowatt
No.
is on my bill.
The total, my total bill from December, the total kilowatts and then the total time is close to 18, but I pay an extra penny a kilowatt hour for 100% renewable.
Right, yeah. I was gonna say, so I looked at mine, and it's about 17, I'm paying 2 cents for the renewable, so it's really 15, right? The 7.6 that you're looking at is one of the charges on your bill. I mean, I'm sure that number appears there, right? But they'll typically break out the generation cost and the transmission and distribution costs separately, and you've gotta add those up. Electric bills can be very confusing, right? I like his approach. You just take the total bill and you see how many kilowatt hours did I use and you divide. That's really what you're paying, right? Whether it's taxes or fees or you know, a lot of different ways it's broken out. Anyway, looking at this, let's look at the cheapest things, right? The things furthest to the left. And those would be gas combined cycle, right? Lots of natural gas power plants being built around the country. Wind, lots of wind farms being built, and solar PV, thin film or crystalline utility scale. These are the cheapest ways to generate electricity right now. And if you look at what's being built in the country, it's exactly those three things. There are very few coal plants and only 2 nuclear plants under construction in the country. It's all about gas, wind, and solar, particularly gas and wind.
Now, do these figures include the cost of storage? Since different forms
The
have
storage
different problems with
electricity,
storing the energy?
They do not, no. That's a very good point. They also do not include any sort of government incentives or subsidies. So things like the production tax credit and the investment tax credit do not show up on this chart. They actually have another chart just like it that includes those, that shifts the renewables significantly to the left.
You showed how Michigan was bigger than the rest of the states in gas storage.
Yes.
How does it rank with other states with energy storage?
In terms of electricity?
Yeah, well, like electric and...
Yeah. So if you look at how utilities can balance out their load by storing energy temporarily, right? The predominantly and leading way that's done all across the world is not with batteries. That's what you read about right now. Batteries, and there's some of that being done, particularly in Hawaii and California. But the predominant way it's done is with pumped storage. And again, Michigan kind of falls right in line with that. We have the Ludington Pumped Storage Facility. It was built when 2 of our nuclear power plants were constructed, so that the power plants could be run all through the night. And at night, they pump water up into the reservoir on the hill, and during the day when we need the electricity, they run it down through turbines and generate electricity. And it acts in net like a giant battery. Specifically to your question, I don't know how we rank with other
What my
states.
information is that there's only 5 states that have more energy storage.
I believe that, yeah. There's not a lot of pumped storage facilities in the U.S.
California has water reservoirs in the mountains, and so at night they pump residential water up into the mountains, and in the daytime they get the water and the power back. And the Tennessee Valley Authority is the other area where people pump off a dam and then take it back the next day.
They're also in Iowa doing some energy storage with compressed air and underground caverns, but I don't have any figures on that. If you look at the deployment of solar and wind as a percentage of electricity supply, Europe's in the lead. What we've got here is blue for wind and red for solar. They're getting 11+% of their total electricity from wind and solar, but the United States is second there, maybe 6.5%. Japan is predominantly solar rather than wind, which is different than all the other countries, right? And this development is ongoing. So this is where I said, in the beginning, solar and wind are now no longer trivial, right? You can't say 11% of your production is trivial. They're still pretty small. So again, if we're going to not only make our electric production green, but we're going to make our transportation sector green, right now it looks like the way that's going to happen is electric vehicles, right? For a while, bets were on hydrogen and fuel cells. That's discussion has dramatically shifted to electric vehicles. Electric vehicle sales are climbing fast. This is global figures. This is plug-in vehicles. So this would be either an all-electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid. The bars here show the number of vehicles sold in the year, and these are in thousands, right? And then the orange exponential curve there is the total number of vehicles in operation. There are 3.1 million plug-in vehicles in operation in the world. Now, it seems kind of strange to us here, I think, because Michigan is not where they are. Okay? About half of them are in China. And within the U.S., the concentration is highly in California, right? So we don't encounter them nearly so much. But they're still less than 1.5% of sales and 0.3% of the total vehicle fleet. Not enough to make much difference yet, and we'll see if the growth trends continue or not. This shows where they're selling. So you can see the United States, we got two shades of red here. United States down here, China, about half of the world's sales. There's our color codes. Oh, the European Union, Norway. Norway has the highest per capita concentration of electric vehicles in the world. So if anybody says electric vehicles don't work in cold climates, yeah. These are projections of electric vehicle sales from two different consulting firms showing these exponential growths. The U.S. Energy Information Administration is not so rosy about their future. I'm not big on these kind of projections because I've just seen them be wrong over again. Time will tell what comes from that. But suppose we were going to replace our fleet of petroleum-powered internal combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles. What would that mean to the electric grid? Here in the U.S., we drive about 3 trillion miles a year. That's one with 12 zeros, right? And as I look at different electric vehicles out there, they get roughly 3 miles to a kilowatt hour. It's like we say how many miles per gallon, we get 3 miles to a kilowatt hour, right? So at 3 miles per kilowatt hour, we need to add 1 trillion kilowatt hours of electric production if all of our transportation was going to be electrified. We're producing almost 4 trillion kilowatt hours, so we need to increase our production by about a quarter. I think that's just an interesting statistic, right? If you did that, you said, well, we have to increase our electricity production tenfold, that would be very disturbing. 25% is doable, particularly if the vehicles are charged at night when so many of the power plants are idle, although that might not apply if more of the power plants are solar, in which case we might actually want to charge them midday. The automakers are all in a race. The news is full of electric vehicle news. France and the United Kingdom have banned internal combustion engines by 2040. Wow. VW has pledged $40 billion in research and development money. That's not development. That's not actual production money over the next 5 years. Yes?
Is this a ban, or is this a ban on production of these vehicles?
That's a great question. I believe it's a ban on new sales, not operation. There are 24 EV models available in North America right now. I surely could name them, and there's only 2 or 3 that are dominating sales. GM's pledged 2 new EV models in 18 months and 20 by 2023. Ford's going to invest $11 billion in EVs by 2022. That was just in the recent news. Daimler has pledged $10 billion. There's a lot of investment, a lot of R&D going into electric vehicles. There's a lot of policy discussions about recharging stations and how we're going to do that. But we're going to move on from electric vehicles and talk about wind power. So I'm going to talk about gigawatts of electric generating capacity. And it's kind of a big number, right? So for comparison here, a large power plant is about 1 gigawatt. So the Fermi nuclear plant is 1.1 gigawatts. Total electric generating capacity in Michigan is 30 gigawatts. In the United States, 1,074 gigawatts. I'm just throwing those numbers out so when I show you other numbers, you have a basis of comparison, right? Is 400 gigawatts big or small, right? And well, it's pretty big, right?
Yes. Is that per year?
No, so this is generating capacity. This is how much, if all of our power plants ran at the same time, how much power did it put out? Now, we don't run every power plant all the time, right? They're shifted to meet demand. And so we call that comparison a capacity factor, right? What percent of their theoretical output are they actually producing the way we operate them? So if you look at, say, a nuclear plant, they're operated at pretty much 7 by 24 unless they're down for refueling or maintenance of some kind. And they typically have a capacity factor of 98%, right? They're putting out pretty much as much power as they're rated to put out all the time. If you look at wind or solar, where you don't decide how much it's going to produce in general, right? You might cap it on rare occasions, but in general, it's maybe a 30% capacity factor on wind, sometimes 40 at a very good wind site, or solar down at 20-25% of capacity. So if you compare a gigawatt of wind with a gigawatt nuclear power plant, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges, because the nuclear plant's going to put out more power, more total energy, same power, more energy over the year, because it's operating 7 by 24. So this is global capacity and installation of wind. So the total bar here is the amount of wind capacity that's installed and operating, and the top there is the amount that got added. So at the end of 2016 in the world, we had 287 gigawatts of wind power production or capacity. Given that the whole US is 1,074, that's a lot. This is not true. And 55 of that was added during the year. About half of that was in China. China is the world leader in EVs, solar, and wind. And it's not a small leadership. They're way out ahead. So here you see China's installed base and their additions during the year. The U.S. is number 2 here, and other countries behind that.
What's that figure per capita?
That would be a great number to know, or per dollar of GDP, and I don't have those numbers. But obviously China's population is about 4 times the size of the U.S., so if I did it per capita, yeah, it would look good. I want to talk about grid stability. So aside from, well, renewables are just too expensive, this is getting a lot of attention now. Well, wind and solar are intermittent, and if we put too much of them on the grid's going to become unstable. No doubt that's true if you don't take, remedial measures.